William Tallon was on duty the morning of August 4th, 2000, when his partner, Reginald Wilcock, served the Queen Mother her 100th birthday morning tea in her room at Clarence House. That same night, at the Royal Opera House, Talon learned that Wilcock was dying. A week later, Wilcock was dead, aged 66. Talon arranged the funeral at the Queen's Chapel in Marlborough House, with the kind of access that only a man who had spent 5 decades in royal service could command. No journalist knew any of this. The official biography of the Queen Mother, published 9 years later at 1,096 pages, does not appear to have recorded it either. William John Stevenson Talon, known to tabloid photographers as Backstairs Billy, formally titled Steward and Page of the Backstairs, entered the Queen Mother's private rooms without knocking. He bought the Christmas presents she gave to others, he arranged her guests, managed her household's daily rhythms, and spent over 50 years in closer proximity to one of the most carefully constructed public images in 20th century Britain than any journalist ever came. The Queen Mother gave exactly 0 media interviews in 101 years of public life. Not one. No journalist sat across from her at Clarence House and asked what she actually thought about anything. No authorized autobiography, no farewell address explaining who she was at 9 in the morning rather than at 2 in the afternoon, in front of the cameras. The image, the wartime solidarity, the unbroken wave, the smile that Cecil Beaton once described as a marshmallow made on a welding machine, was total, curated, and extraordinarily durable. But Stephen Tennant, who moved in her social world and recorded his impressions, described something quite different. She looked everything that she wasn't, he wrote. Gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity. Cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. 2 portraits, one a marshmallow, one a welding machine, both named observers, both in a position to see. The gap between them is exactly the territory this script covers, because the people who could have closed that gap reliably weren't journalists or commissioned biographers. They were the people who served her, and what they recorded in memoirs and diaries and household accounts they waited decades to share turns out to be more specific, more candid, and in several verifiable cases, more historically accurate than anything the official record produced. The most revealing royal history often comes from the people close enough to watch the mask slip, but low status enough to be unguarded around. Servants have always been accused of having axes to grind. It's a reasonable objection to any below-stairs account, and it would be dishonest to brush past it. The case for taking staff testimony seriously doesn't require dismissing that objection. It requires understanding why the objection is incomplete. The academic framework comes from Lucy Delap, a Cambridge historian who published Knowing Their Place, Domestic Service in 20th Century Britain, through Oxford University Press in 2011. Delap's central finding is that historians have consistently undervalued servant testimony as a historical source, not because it's inherently unreliable, but because the archive it belongs to has been systematically treated as secondary. Employers, she documents, are rarely heard in oral testimonies or live role play. The record of the domestic relationship skews toward the servant's perspective for a structural reason. Servants had more cause to keep accounts, and far less institutional power to suppress them. The logic of what made royal servants particularly valuable as observers is worth establishing carefully. The ideal household servant in mid-20th century Britain was expected to be simultaneously visible and invisible, present enough to maintain appearances, absent enough not to intrude on intimacy. As one study of the period puts it, armies of servants were deliberately rendered invisible. The paradox is that this invisibility created optimal conditions for unguarded observation. When someone forgets you're in the room, they stop performing for you. The servants' hall had its own information economy. Staff have a way of finding out about such things, as one account of royal household life notes, meaning that what any individual member of the household personally witnessed was supplemented by the collective knowledge of the below-stairs community. A footman might see one piece. A lady's maid saw another. The page who entered without knocking saw a third. By the time a senior member of the household had served 10 or 15 years, their informational picture of the principal was more complete than any single biographer's archive. The below-stairs memoir tradition in Britain runs back to the 19th century, preserved in diaries, letters, and eventually print. Margaret Powell's memoir, Below Stairs, published in 1968 and describing domestic service in the 1920s, established a popular audience for this kind of account. But the royal household added a specific and important layer. The social cost of publication was high enough to suppress almost everything for decades at a time, which means that the accounts which did eventually surface had been held back by genuine institutional pressure rather than simply never committed to paper. Marion Crawford, governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret from 1933 until her retirement in 1949, published The Little Princesses in 1950. By the standards of royal disclosure, the content was mild. The princesses bit their nails. Margaret bit her sister. The bedrooms at the palace were pink and fawn with plain white furniture. But it was unauthorized, and the consequence was total and permanent. Crawford became, as subsequent accounts document it, a non-person as far as the royal family was concerned. Her former employers never contacted her again. She was erased from royal correspondence as efficiently as a dismissed courtier from an earlier century. Her case set the template for every royal household employee who came after her. Publish and be cast out. The deterrent wasn't vague. It had a named example and a specific, documented outcome. Which is why William Tallon refused the large sums of cash tabloid newspapers offered him after his 1991 scandal. Why he declined every subsequent interview request. Why he died in 2007, having given the public nothing, and having given the institution 50 years of absolute discretion. The limitations of the accounts that do survive are real and deserve naming. Staff memoirs tend to be retrospective, composed or delivered years after the events they describe, shaped by everything that happened in between. They're filtered by publishers' requirements, libel lawyers' caution, and whatever financial or personal pressure the author was navigating. Some were exaggerated, consciously or not, by the softening effects of time and the desire for a coherent story. There is also what might be called the deference distortion, an ingrained reluctance in mid-20th century British service culture to say plainly that the person you served was difficult. The result is that staff accounts often land softer than the reality they're describing, which means that when someone does record a sharp observation, Roy Strong's diary entry on Princess Margaret, Colin Burgess's equerry account of the Queen Mother's daily drinking, the sharpness tends to be real rather than performed. Grievance produces complaints. Deference produces understatement. Most royal household testimony sits in the second category, which means even the mildly damaging observations reflect behavior that was probably rather more striking than described. And there is the proximity advantage that no official biographer can replicate. An official biographer reads the Queen Mother's letters in the royal archives, in a room allocated by the palace, with access determined by the institution. William Tallon read the room. He knew which guests weren't invited back. He knew what was said after the formal meal ended. He knew what happened in the household on a morning in 1952, not because he was briefed about it, but because he was there. That distinction between archival knowledge and lived proximity is what makes the below-stairs record worth examining seriously as history, even accounting for all its limitations. Both kinds of evidence are partial. They're partial in different directions, and the gap between them is where the actual person tends to live. At Clarence House, in the years after King George VI's death in 1952, the Queen Mother's household ran approximately 60 staff. The annual wage bill was roughly £1.5 million. 27 of those staff members lived on the premises rent-free. The financial overhead of a royal widow who received an annual civil list payment wasn't small, and it didn't stay contained. Her accountant was a man named Patrick Kyle. His wife reportedly begged him consistently to resign from the engagement. He didn't resign. He continued managing the finances of a household that, according to the most reliable contemporaneous reporting, had accumulated an overdraft at Coutts Bank of £4 million by the time the Queen Mother died on March 30th, 2002. The Guardian, reporting the day after her death, quoted the Queen on this. "Coutts would have folded long ago, but for Mummy's overdraft." It's one of the few documented direct quotes from the Queen about her mother's finances, and it captures, in 11 words, a domestic reality that Shawcross's 1,000 pages of authorized biography didn't quite address. The drinking habits are the best evidenced section of the private record, documented by multiple named sources working from personal observation rather than hearsay. The morning drink was gin and Dubonnet, mixed at 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin, served with ice and a slice of lemon. Peter Dorelli, who served her, documented the recipe precisely. Margaret Rhodes, the Queen Mother's own niece and a woman who served as one of her ladies-in-waiting, confirmed the routine, describing it as something that never varied. Dubonnet and gin before lunch, wine with the meal, a dry martini before dinner, a glass of champagne with it. Veuve Clicquot was the preferred brand, and by one account she was the firm's largest single private client. Major Colin Burgess, who served as equerry from 1994 to 1996 and later published Behind Palace Doors, recalled that the routine could be rather more flexible than Rhodes's account suggested. A post-lunch glass of port wasn't unusual. Up to 2 martinis might precede dinner rather than 1. Burgess, a young guards officer at the time, admitted he sometimes found it necessary to retreat to his office after a heavy lunch and sleep with his arms resting in the open drawers of his desk. He described the Queen Mother as a devoted drinker, a precise phrase that has survived in the record and that a former Sun Royal correspondent, Charles Ray, later endorsed. Not an alcoholic exactly, but a devoted drinker. The distinction is meaningful, and it's the one that multiple named sources appear to converge on. The writer Nancy Mitford attended at least one Queen Mother lunch and recorded what she observed: 2 dry martinis before the meal, wine throughout, and port afterward. Mitford noted that everyone was exhausted trying to keep up with the consumption. The guests flagged. The Queen Mother didn't. A handwritten note, sold at auction in 2008 among William Tallon's personal effects, captures the practical management of this habit. Written by the Queen Mother to Talon, it requests that he include 2 bottles of Dubonnet and gin in the packing for a picnic, adding, in careful understatement, in case it's needed. The note sold among a collection of items that together raised £440,000. One of Talon's documented duties at Clarence House lunch parties was ensuring that no glass remained empty. According to one account, he would pour wine through a guest's fingers if they tried to cover their glass to halt the refills. Margaret Rhodes, when Tom Quinn's 2014 biography characterized the Queen Mother as having been drunk and dotty for her last 2 decades, pushed back firmly. She confirmed the gin. She disputed the collapse. Buckingham Palace formally rejected Quinn's characterizations. That response is itself illuminating. What was being disputed was the degree of impairment, not the existence of the regime. What no one disputes is the regime itself. The political dimensions of the private record are less documented, but equally interesting. Diary notes attributed to Tommy Lascelles and recorded through secondary social sources describe the Queen Mother as terribly Tory in her views, a characterization consistent with her known social circle, but unlikely to survive into the authorized biography. The Guardian's review of Shawcross's official biography noted what wasn't in Shawcross's 1,000 pages: the gap between the public image of wartime solidarity and the private record that staff accounts preserved. Both quotes appear in the Shawcross biography itself, surfacing in the early sections before the authorized sympathies fully settle in. They are the moments when the archive speaks despite the biographer. Tallon's role at the center of this household gave him an informational archive that the royal archives couldn't replicate. He knew the people who owed money. He knew which guests stopped getting invitations and why. He saw the gap between the Queen Mother's public graciousness and her private sharpness, and he maintained complete discretion about both for his entire working life and beyond. He died on November 23, 2007, aged 72, of liver failure. 8 months later, the auction of his personal belongings, gifts, letters, photographs, royal memorabilia, raised £440,000. What it didn't include was a published account of what he had seen. He never wrote one. He never authorized one. He refused every approach. The Guardian, covering the West End play about his life that opened in 2023, quoted the director Michael Grandage on what he remembered from meeting Talon. A very interesting dynamic where the Queen Mother was clearly the boss, but he was very much supporting her by guiding her to all the right places. The intimacy of that dynamic, the boss and the aide, each knowing what the other needed, was never described in print by the man who lived inside it. February 2002. Princess Margaret died. Less than a month later, 10 of her household staff were made redundant and ordered out of their grace and favor apartments at Kensington Palace. No extended notice period. The apartments were needed. That isn't a minor administrative detail. It's the structural context for everything that follows. The people who spent years organizing their lives around the rhythms and demands of a royal principle did so without any form of security. Service, however long, conferred no tenure. Peter Russell joined Princess Margaret's household as Chief of Staff in 1954 and served for 14 years until 1968, a period that runs from the post-coronation years through the height of her public celebrity and into the cultural shift of the late 1960s. Throughout that entire period, he kept a journal. He didn't open it for decades after leaving her service. What the journal records is the daily mechanics of proximity, the operational requirements of serving someone who insisted that staff stand beside her at formal engagements holding ashtrays, positioned so that she never had to reach for one. Princess Margaret's dresser, Sandra Morgan, who served her for 12 years until Margaret's death, managed 3 full outfit changes per day, with matching accessories for each, appropriate for lunch, afternoon, and evening. The precision of these requirements wasn't occasional. It was the operational baseline of the household. Paul Burrell, who served in the royal household and later wrote about its culture, described an illuminating domestic habit. Margaret would test the television upon returning home from an evening out, pressing her hand against the set to determine whether it was warm, which would indicate the servants had been watching it in her absence. Whether this was systematic surveillance or occasional instinct isn't confirmed across multiple sources, but it reflects something real about the texture of the working environment, a household where the principal's authority extended to monitoring what domestic staff did in their own time, behind closed doors she nominally shared with them. Roy Strong's diary, Strong being a writer and cultural figure who moved in Margaret's social world for decades, contains a line that has survived in the record largely because it's impossible to improve on. She is, as we all know, tiresome, spoilt, idle, and irritating. Strong wasn't Staff. He was Margaret's social equal by any reasonable measure. The phrase, "as we all know," is the telling part. It suggests a shared acknowledgement among her own world that was rarely committed to paper. Craig Brown's 2017 book, Ma'am Darling, assembled 99 vignettes of Princess Margaret from letters, diaries, interviews, newspaper cuttings, and recorded conversations across decades. It's one of the more methodologically honest approaches to a royal subject. Rather than arguing for a single coherent portrait, it accumulates fragments and lets them sit in productive tension. The picture that emerges is genuinely complicated. A woman capable of deep loyalty and real warmth, who also generated what Vogue's review of the book reached for as a chain-smoking, chain-drinking, man-eating monster with flashes of wit. Too flat as a characterization, but it captures why the more restrained accounts tend to carry more credibility. The people with closest access were also, in most cases, the least hyperbolic about what they saw. Anne Glenconnor's position requires precision. She served as extra lady-in-waiting to Princess Margaret from 1971 until Margaret's death in 2002. 31 years in close proximity. Her 2019 memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, became a bestseller. But her structural position was different from domestic staff. She was a friend first, chosen for the lady-in-waiting role precisely because she was already trusted. Princess Margaret, Glenconnor explains in the book, picked her friends to be a lady-in-waiting, and all of us were friends of Margaret for quite some time. The invisibility mechanism worked differently here. Margaret was unguarded around Glenconnor, not because she forgot Glenconnor was watching, but because she trusted her implicitly. What Glenconnor describes isn't a tyrant. It's also not an uncomplicated friend. She recalls roaring with laughter. "I never laughed so much," and describes an incident involving shoes. Margaret examined Glenconnor's flat shoes, looked back at her and said, with what Glenconnor remembers as some tartness, "Okay, Anne, you win this time." Then put on the flat shoes. The moment is small. It's also specific in the way only first-hand observation is specific. The tartness is in the detail. The detail is what makes it real. There is a Christmas detail worth recording because it illuminates the two women's different household cultures in a single comparison. The Queen Mother had a practice of removing herself from formal dining at Christmas so that the Clarence House staff could attend the Buckingham Palace staff parties. Princess Margaret scheduled dinner parties on those same evenings, which meant the Kensington Palace staff couldn't go. Whether this was deliberate policy or simple indifference isn't recorded. The outcome was the same, and it was noted. The evictions after Margaret's death are the clearest expression of the household's structural reality. 10 staff members who had organized their lives around her service, some of them for years, were made redundant and told to vacate their palace apartments within a month. The grace and favor arrangement dissolved as soon as the person generating it was gone. The institution that required their discretion while she lived wasted no time releasing them from the obligation once she died. They took their memories with them. Sir Alan Lascelles, Tommy to everyone who knew him, was born on the 11th of April, 1887, and began keeping his diary in earnest around 1905, at the age of 18. By 1920, he was serving as Assistant Private Secretary to the Prince of Wales, a role he held through a decade of behavior that would eventually produce the 1936 abdication crisis. In 1943, he was appointed Private Secretary to King George VI, the most senior administrative position in the royal household. He held that role under George VI and then, for 1 year, under Queen Elizabeth II, after the king's death in 1952. He formally left the private secretary role in 1953 and died on 10th August 1981, aged 94. His diaries were published in 2006 under the title King's Counselor, Abdication and War, edited by Duff Hart Davis. 2 further volumes of earlier material appeared in 2024. Kenneth Rose, the biographer and diarist who knew Lascelles personally, described the journal as the most detailed historical source on the appearance, looks, and activities of the royal family. It's a strong claim, but the published portions support it. The entries are specific, dated, named, and written by someone who was present for events, rather than reconstructing them afterward. Lascelles wasn't a man given to disloyalty for its own sake. He described his commitment to the crown in near categorical terms. It's no use going about the world singing "God Save the King" if one isn't prepared to back words with actions. He was a man of severe moral standards and deep institutional investment, and his severity is precisely what makes his observations useful. He didn't exaggerate for effect. When he recorded a damning observation, it was because his own standards required the honest record. His most significant published passage concerns Edward VIII, and specifically the narrative that framed the abdication. The prevailing romantic story, the king who fell deeply in love for the first time in his life, who chose a woman over a throne, was, in Lascelles' assessment, fiction. He called it moonshine. The reality, he wrote, was that Edward was never out of the thrall of one female after another. There was always a grande affaire, and coincidentally, as I know to my cost, an unbroken series of petites affairs, contracted and consummated in whatever highways and byways of the empire he was traversing at the moment. 3 words in that passage are doing the most work. As I know to my cost. Lascelles wasn't reporting secondhand. He had been present. He had served Edward as a private secretary through the 1920s and watched his conduct from inside it. By 1927, he was so enraged by his employer's behavior that he contemplated writing directly to the king, Edward's father, about it. The diary entries from this period are the record of someone who watched a royal mythology being assembled in real time and knew, from proximity, exactly what it was assembled to conceal. The Townsend affair placed Lascelles at the center of a different kind of royal private drama. When Princess Margaret's relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend became a constitutional question in the early 1950s, Lascelles was the person who spelled out to the Queen the requirements of the Royal Marriages Act. Townsend recorded in his own account that both agreed he should leave the Queen Mother's household. The relationship eventually ended. Princess Margaret, in later life, said that Lascelles had ruined her life. The accuracy of that accusation is less interesting than what it illustrates about the courtier class as a distinct category of witness. Lascelles wasn't passive. He wasn't simply recording, he was participating. His diaries carry the weight of active involvement in the events they describe. Talon saw what happened in the rooms. Lascelles shaped what happened in the meetings. That's a different kind of proximity, and it produced a different kind of record. Less about private daily behavior, and more about the constitutional mechanisms that royal privacy was designed to protect. John Colville provides a useful parallel. Colville served as private secretary to 3 prime ministers, Chamberlain, Attlee, and Churchill, and then as private secretary to Princess Elizabeth after her marriage. His diary, published in 1985 as The Fringes of Power, covers 1939 to 1955. His position was unusual, even by courtier standards. He moved between Downing Street and the royal household, which meant he observed the relationship between the elected government and the crown from both sides simultaneously. He recorded events that Churchill later mentioned casually in common speeches, with no public context for where the information originated. Colville's diary supplied the private backstory. That is the function courtier testimony performs at its most historically valuable. It preserves the conversation that the public statement was designed to replace. The caveat about Lascelles must be stated clearly. He knew his diaries might be read, and he wrote with posterity in mind. His accounts are candid, but they are also selective. A man who described his commitment to the crown in categorical terms wasn't going to record everything he knew. His criticism of Edward VIII is withering, but it also happens to align precisely with Lascelles's own moral framework and his sense of what the historical record required. Other things, presumably, he judged unnecessary for history to know. That selective candor doesn't invalidate what he chose to write. A partial record, honestly maintained by someone who was present, is more reliable than a complete account written by someone who could only access the material the institution had decided to preserve. The authorized biography is a specific genre with specific structural constraints. It requires access. Access requires cooperation. Cooperation requires conditions. The palace controls the archive, which letters survive, which diaries are made available, which rooms the biographer is permitted to work in. And those conditions aren't neutral. William Shawcross was given what he described as complete access to the Queen Mother's personal letters and diaries for the official biography published in 2009. The Guardian's reviewer read through all 1,096 pages and noted that one decade glided into another across chapter after chapter, with the basic pattern of her days, weeks, months, and years being fairly constant. Then the reviewer noted what wasn't there. Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman whose relationship with Prince Charles had directly shaped the emotional landscape of the Queen Mother's final decades, appears once in the entire text. Page 795. She is identified as the wife of a named guest in a 1970s visitor's book entry. The response in the review? If it's hard to respect a biographer capable of an omission on the Camilla scale, it's impossible to trust him. What else has he left out? Royal wills have been systematically sealed since the early 20th century, the practice established to secure confidentiality. The Royal Archives, the source on which authorized biographers depend, holds what the institution chose to keep and what it decided to make accessible. That is a different thing from the full historical record. Marion Crawford's 1950 memoir provides the clearest illustration of what happens when someone steps outside this system. The Little Princesses wasn't explosive. The princesses bit their nails. The governess recalled warm domestic scenes, but it was unauthorized, and the punishment was permanent. A non-person as far as the royal family was concerned. The people who came after Crawford understood this. Their silence wasn't accidental. It was the rational response to a deterrent that had been made unmistakably clear. The testimony that survived did so because the people who held it either waited long enough that the consequences had expired, or decided that the historical record was worth more than the remaining social cost. Some waited for the death of everyone who might have contested what they wrote. Peter Russell, who kept his journal throughout 14 years of Chief of Staff service in Princess Margaret's household, didn't open it for decades after leaving her service. The waiting itself tells a story about what kind of record this was. It wasn't manufactured for immediate commercial gain. It was held, carefully, for the moment when it could be released without destroying the person releasing it. What the surviving accounts contain is different in character from what the Royal Archives hold. The Queen Mother's official letters, the ones that formed the basis of Shawcross's biography, were written by a woman who knew they might eventually be read. The material contained in staff memoirs, equerry accounts, and courtier diaries was generated in circumstances where that awareness was absent or suppressed. Nancy Mitford recording a queen who outlasted every guest at a lunch. That was a social observation written because it was interesting, not because anyone would check it against a diplomatic file. The handwritten note requesting gin and Dubonnet for a picnic, in case it's needed. That was a private communication sold at auction 23 years after her death, preserved not by the palace, but by the man the palace had employed and then released without ceremony. Each of those fragments tells a different story than the official biography does, not because Shawcross was dishonest. He was, by most accounts, a serious historian working within significant constraints, but because the material he was working with was what the institution had decided to preserve, and what the institution decided to preserve wasn't the full record. The palace, as an institution, produces two archives simultaneously: the one it curates and controls, and the one it creates in the people it employs and then dismisses. The curated archive gets the authorized biographies. The uncurated archive surfaces slowly, late, selectively. In the memoirs of equerries, the diaries of courtiers, the recollections of ladies-in-waiting who outlived their principals by decades. It survives as long as the people who hold it survive. After the Queen Mother died, William Tallon was fired and moved to a ground-floor flat in Kennington. After Princess Margaret died, 10 staff members were evicted from Kensington Palace within a month. The institution that required their silence while they served it released them from the obligation the moment the principal was gone. They took their memories with them. The literary critic who reviewed the Shawcross biography for Literary Review described the Queen Mother's life as one of the longest, happiest, and most successful of her century. Meanwhile, the equerry who served her recalled that it wasn't unusual for her to have more than 6 drinks a day. Nancy Mitford watched her exhaust every guest at a lunch that ended with port. Stephen Tennant wrote that she looked everything that she wasn't, that behind the apparent gentleness, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. And the man who was closest to her for 50 years, who entered her rooms without knocking, who arranged her guests and her drinks and the funeral of his partner, took everything he knew to a ground-floor flat in Kennington and then to his grave, without a word. The official history remembered what the palace announced. The staff remembered what the palace was. If you want more history told from the inside out, subscribe. A new story every week.